Michael sat in the quiet of his garage, the rhythmic hum of tools and the scent of motor oil grounding him in a way few things could. It was his sanctuary, a stark contrast to the chaos that seemed to define his marriage. He thought back to the beginning, how Emily had captivated him with her charm and confidence. She was everything he wasn't, bold, magnetic, and commanding attention wherever she went. From the moment they met, Michael was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. But over the years, that flame had turned scorching. Emily had a way of bending everything, including him, to her will. She decided where they lived, who they spent time with, and even how he dressed. At first, Michael had seen it as her strong personality, but now he wasn't so sure. The night before had been another example. Emily and her friends had gathered at their house for drinks, filling the living room with laughter and the sharp clinking of glasses. Michael had offered to help, but Emily had dismissed him with a wave. "You just get in the way," she'd said with a smirk, leaving him to retreat to his garage. Later, when they left, Emily's parting words still lingered in his mind. "You're lucky I put up with this boring life. Maybe I'll find someone who appreciates me." She had laughed as though it were a joke, but Michael wasn't sure anymore. Even now, as he wiped his hands on a rag, he couldn't shake the sense that something was deeply wrong. The morning after Emily's biting remark, Michael woke to an empty bed. The scent of her floral perfume lingered faintly on her pillow, but the warmth of her presence was long gone. He glanced at the clock. 7:45 a.m. Emily rarely woke up before 9, especially after a night out. Sliding out of bed, he found a note on the kitchen counter. It was hastily written on a scrap of paper. "Gone to yoga with Rachel. Don't wait up for breakfast." Michael frowned. Emily hadn't mentioned yoga in years, let alone an early morning session. A flicker of doubt crossed his mind, but he pushed it aside. He told himself he was being paranoid. By mid-morning, Michael was in his garage again, tinkering with a vintage motorcycle he'd been restoring for months. The hum of the world outside was distant here, the clatter of tools soothing as he worked. But no matter how much he focused on the task at hand, Emily's absence gnawed at him. Her recent behavior had been different, more abrupt, more secretive. She spent more time out with friends, coming home late with vague excuses. When he asked her about it, she brushed him off, her tone laced with irritation. "It's nothing, Michael. I don't have to account for every second of my day," she'd said last week when he questioned a late-night outing. Her words had stung, but it was the look in her eyes, a mix of impatience and something else he couldn't place, that haunted him. He had learned to let it go, or at least pretend to. But this morning, something felt different. While rummaging through the kitchen for a snack, Michael noticed Emily's laptop on the counter. She rarely left it lying around, always carrying it upstairs to their bedroom or locking it in her home office. A pang of hesitation struck him. Was he really going to do this? His hands trembled slightly as he opened the lid. The screen lit up, revealing a cluttered desktop. Michael searched for anything unusual: emails, documents, photos. He told himself he was only looking for reassurance, not evidence. But then he found it. A folder titled Receipts caught his attention. Inside, among the usual grocery and clothing store transactions, was a receipt from a high-end restaurant downtown. The date was last Thursday, the night Emily claimed she had been at Rachel's house watching movies. Michael stared at the screen, his chest tightening. 2 entrees, a bottle of wine, and dessert. This wasn't a casual outing with friends. He closed the laptop and stepped back, his breath uneven. Was he jumping to conclusions? Maybe it was nothing, just a misunderstanding. Yet a nagging voice in the back of his mind whispered otherwise. By the time Emily returned that afternoon, Michael had convinced himself to stay quiet, for now. She strolled into the house, her gym bag slung over one shoulder, a confident smile on her face. "How was yoga?" he asked casually, masking his tension. "Great," she replied breezily. "Rachel's instructor is amazing. You should try it sometime." She laughed lightly, kissing his cheek before heading upstairs. Michael stood frozen in the kitchen, the phantom receipt flashing in his mind. Her words were smooth, her demeanor calm, but something about the way she avoided his gaze told him all he needed to know. That night, as Emily slept soundly beside him, Michael lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The question swirled in his mind, unrelenting. He wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. But he couldn't ignore the growing weight in his chest, the sense that their marriage was built on a foundation that was beginning to crack. The days that followed the receipt discovery were a blur for Michael. He threw himself into work and his projects, hoping the distraction would quiet the storm brewing in his mind. But every time Emily laughed at her phone or left the room to take a call, his chest tightened with unease. One evening, after Emily had gone out yet again, Michael sat at the dining table, nursing a cup of coffee gone cold. The house felt too large, its emptiness a stark reminder of how distant they had become. A memory of their early days together surfaced, how she used to sit across from him, sketching designs while he worked on his laptop. They used to dream together, talk for hours about their future. Now, those moments seemed like a lifetime ago. As Michael rinsed his mug in the sink, he noticed Emily's phone buzzing on the counter. She had forgotten it, an unusual oversight for someone who treated her phone like an extension of herself. He hesitated, the memory of the receipt fresh in his mind. His instincts screamed that this was a line he shouldn't cross, but curiosity and doubt gnawed at him. He picked up the phone. The lock screen displayed a string of notifications. Texts from Rachel, a few from their mutual friends, and one from an unknown number. Michael stared at the unknown sender's message. Had a great time last night. Can't wait to see you again. His stomach dropped. The timestamp showed it had been sent just an hour ago, while Emily was supposedly at a work dinner. Michael put the phone down as if it had burned him. His breath came in shallow gasps, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He felt an odd mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. Was this really happening? Was Emily capable of something like this? When Emily returned home later that night, Michael was sitting in the living room, pretending to read a book. She entered with her usual flair, tossing her coat onto the back of a chair. "Work dinner went late," she said nonchalantly, kicking off her heels. "What did you do all evening?" Michael looked up, forcing a calm tone. "Not much. Just caught up on some reading." Emily smiled, but Michael noticed a faint flicker of something in her expression. Unease, perhaps? She turned and headed upstairs, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The next morning, Michael decided he couldn't keep ignoring the signs. He began paying closer attention to Emily's behavior, piecing together small inconsistencies in her stories. The more he observed, the clearer it became that she was hiding something. Her outings became more frequent, her excuses thinner. She started dressing up more, wearing perfumes he hadn't smelled in years. Her phone was always on her now, clutched tightly like a lifeline. One afternoon, Michael's opportunity came. Emily had left her laptop open again, a rare lapse in her usual vigilance. This time, he didn't hesitate. His hands trembled as he navigated her email account. Most of the messages were mundane, but one thread caught his attention. An exchange with someone named Aaron. The emails were friendly at first, discussing shared interests, but as Michael scrolled, the tone shifted. "Aaron, last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. Emily, same. Can't wait for the next time. Let me know when you're free." Michael stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a moment of weakness. Emily was actively pursuing someone else, building a connection right under his nose. He closed the laptop and sank into the chair, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do now? Confront her? Pretend he didn't know? For hours, he sat in the dimly lit room, wrestling with the betrayal and his own sense of failure. Part of him wanted to storm out, to leave her and never look back. But another part, the part that still loved her despite everything, couldn't let go so easily. That evening, as they sat across from each other at the dinner table, Michael studied Emily's face. She looked radiant, her green eyes sparkling as she recounted a story about her day. But all he could hear were Aaron's words echoing in his mind. The woman he had devoted his life to, the woman he had sacrificed so much for, was living a double life. And he had no idea what to do about it. Michael spent the next 2 days in turmoil. The evidence was irrefutable, yet confronting Emily felt like stepping into uncharted territory. He was no stranger to her sharp tongue and her uncanny ability to turn any argument to her advantage. Would she deny it? Would she twist his words and make him feel like the villain? On the third evening, Michael finally reached his breaking point. Emily had just returned from another meeting, her laughter echoing through the hallway as she chatted on the phone. When she saw Michael waiting in the living room, her smile faltered. "Michael," she said, her tone cautious. "Is everything okay?" He motioned for her to sit. She hesitated but complied, dropping her bag on the floor. "We need to talk," he began, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Emily crossed her arms, leaning back in the chair. "Okay, what's this about?" Michael took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I know you've been seeing someone else." Her reaction was instantaneous, eyes widening, cheeks flushing, her posture stiffening. But just as quickly, she regained her composure, tilting her head with a bemused smile. "What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning confusion. Michael felt a surge of anger. "Don't play dumb, Emily. I've seen the messages. I know about Aaron." Her eyes darted away for a split second, barely noticeable, but enough for Michael to catch. "Aaron," she repeated, forcing a laugh. "He's just a friend. We've been working on a project together." "Honestly, Michael, you're being ridiculous." "Ridiculous." Michael's voice rose, his frustration spilling over. "I saw the emails. I saw what you wrote to him. That doesn't sound like work to me." Emily stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You went through my emails," she snapped, her voice sharp with indignation. "Unbelievable. I can't believe you'd invade my privacy like that." Her deflection stung, but Michael refused to back down. "Don't turn this around on me, Emily. I deserve the truth." She paced the room, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor. "Fine," she said finally, her tone icy. "If you must know, Aaron and I had dinner a few times. That's it. Nothing happened. But honestly, can you blame me? Do you know how suffocating this marriage can be sometimes?" Michael's breath caught. "Suffocating," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," she shot back, her green eyes blazing. "You're so predictable, Michael. Always working, always in that garage. Sometimes I feel like I'm living with a roommate, not a husband." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. For years, he had done everything to make her happy, sacrificing his own desires and bending to her every whim. And this was how she saw him. Michael stood, his fists clenching at his sides. "If you were unhappy, why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you try to fix things instead of lying and sneaking around?" Emily rolled her eyes, her exasperation palpable. "Because talking to you is impossible, Michael. You never understand. And honestly, I didn't think it mattered." Her admission left him speechless. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of her words pressing down on them both. Finally, Emily sighed, her voice softening. "Look, I'm sorry if I hurt you. But maybe this is a wake-up call for both of us. We need to figure out what we really want." Michael stared at her, a bitter taste in his mouth. "What I want is a wife who doesn't lie to me, who respects me. Is that too much to ask?" Emily didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her bag and walked toward the door. "I need some air," she said over her shoulder, her tone final. The door closed behind her, leaving Michael alone in the empty house. For the first time, he felt the full weight of the betrayal, not just the infidelity, but the realization that Emily had never truly valued him. He sank into the couch, his head in his hands, as the enormity of the situation washed over him. This wasn't just a crack in their marriage. It was a chasm, and Michael had no idea how to bridge it. Michael woke up the next morning with a lingering sense of unease. The previous night's confrontation had left him emotionally drained, but Emily's words replayed in his mind on a loop. Suffocating. Predictable. Her accusations stung deeply, but more than that, her lack of remorse haunted him. Emily returned home late, well after midnight. She offered no explanation and climbed into bed without a word. Her cold silence was louder than any argument they'd ever had. Determined to uncover the full truth, Michael decided to dig deeper. If Emily refused to be honest, he would find the answers himself. The opportunity came on Saturday. Emily announced she was heading out with Rachel for the afternoon, her voice casual but her demeanor tense. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, Michael began his search. He started with her home office, rifling through drawers and shelves. At first, there was nothing unusual, just files, receipts, and notebooks. But tucked away in the back of a desk drawer, he found an envelope labeled private. Inside were photos, receipts, and handwritten notes. Michael's hands shook as he examined each item. A photograph of Emily at a resort, her arm around a man he didn't recognize. A receipt for a spa weekend dated 2 months ago, one she had claimed was a girl's trip. And then, the most damning piece, a handwritten note in a man's scrawled handwriting. Emily, you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. Can't wait to see you again. Love, Aaron. Michael sat down heavily, the evidence spread out before him. The walls of denial he'd built to protect himself came crashing down. This wasn't just an emotional affair, it was something far more deliberate, calculated, and hurtful. He closed the envelope and placed it back where he found it. His heart ached, but his mind was clear. Emily had been lying to him for months, maybe even years. Later that evening, Michael received a call from Catherine. The only one of Emily's friends he had ever truly liked, Catherine was quiet and unassuming, often the voice of reason in their chaotic social circle. Michael, she began hesitantly, I've been debating whether to call you, but I think you deserve to know. What is it? He asked, his tone wary. It's about Emily. I've seen some things. Things I can't ignore anymore. Catherine's voice trembled slightly, but her words were steady. She's been meeting someone, a man. I don't know all the details, but it's been going on for a while. Rachel knows, and she's been covering for her. Michael closed his eyes, the confirmation both validating and devastating. Why are you telling me this? Because it's wrong, Catherine replied firmly. You're a good man, Michael. You don't deserve this. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. When the call ended, Michael sat in silence, absorbing the weight of Catherine's words. Her revelation was the final piece of the puzzle, the proof he needed to confront Emily once and for all. Emily returned home that night, her mood unusually cheerful. She kissed Michael on the cheek and asked about his day, as if nothing had happened. But Michael couldn't pretend anymore. The walls he had built to protect their marriage were gone, and the truth stood stark and unyielding before him. He didn't confront her immediately. Instead, he watched her closely, noticing every inconsistency, every forced smile. The lies were no longer hidden, they were glaring, undeniable. As the days passed, Michael began to plan. This time, he wouldn't let Emily deflect or manipulate him. He needed answers, closure, and above all, a way to reclaim the dignity he had lost. Michael spent the next few days gathering his thoughts and preparing for what he knew would be the most difficult conversation of his life. He couldn't confront Emily on impulse. He needed to stay calm, factual, and focused. The evidence he'd uncovered, the photos, the notes, the testimony from Catherine, was irrefutable. Now, it was time for Emily to face it. On a quiet Thursday evening, Michael decided it was time. Emily was in the kitchen, humming softly as she poured herself a glass of wine. For a moment, Michael almost faltered. Despite everything, part of him still clung to the image of the woman he had fallen in love with, the vibrant, ambitious Emily who once seemed so full of promise. But that Emily was gone, replaced by someone he could no longer recognize. Emily, he said, stepping into the kitchen, we need to talk. She turned, her expression guarded. What now, Michael? He gestured toward the living room. Can we sit? She rolled her eyes but followed him. Once they were seated, Michael took a deep breath and placed the envelope on the coffee table between them. What's this? Emily asked, her tone laced with irritation. Something I found in your desk, he replied, keeping his voice steady. Go ahead. Open it. Emily hesitated, her fingers hovering over the envelope. When she finally opened it and saw the contents, her face paled. For the first time, she seemed genuinely caught off guard. What is this supposed to prove? She said, her voice defensive. Michael leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "It proves that you've been lying to me. It proves that while I was here, building a life for us, you were out with another man." Emily's jaw tightened. "You went through my things. Do you have any idea how invasive that is?" "I didn't have a choice," Michael shot back. "You weren't going to tell me the truth, were you?" She stood abruptly, pacing the room like a caged animal. "You don't understand, Michael. Things have been complicated." "Complicated," he repeated, his voice rising. "You mean lying, sneaking around, and cheating on your husband? That's complicated." Emily stopped pacing and turned to face him. "You think this is all my fault," she snapped. "You think I just woke up one day and decided to ruin our marriage? Maybe if you'd been more attentive, more exciting, I wouldn't have felt the need to look elsewhere." The words hit Michael like a slap. He stared at her, stunned by the audacity of her justification. "So this is my fault?" he asked, his voice low and incredulous. Emily folded her arms, her expression defiant. "I'm not saying it's entirely your fault, but you're not blameless. Our marriage hasn't been working for a long time, Michael. You just refuse to see it." Michael stood, his hands trembling. "No, Emily. The problem isn't that I refuse to see it. The problem is that instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix things, you decided to betray me. You decided that your happiness was worth more than our marriage." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with tension, the weight of their unspoken grievances threatening to suffocate them both. Finally, Emily sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Maybe we're just not meant to be together anymore," she said quietly. Michael felt a pang of sadness at her words, but also a strange sense of relief. For years, he had clung to the hope that their love could withstand anything. Now, he realized that love alone wasn't enough. "If that's how you feel," he said, his voice steady, "then maybe you're right." Emily looked at him, surprised by his calm tone. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I deserve better," Michael replied. "I've spent years trying to make you happy, trying to be the husband you wanted. But I can't keep doing this. Not if you're not willing to meet me halfway." Emily's eyes flickered with something Michael couldn't quite place. Regret, perhaps, or maybe just guilt. But she didn't argue. She simply nodded, her expression unreadable. Michael turned and walked toward the stairs, his heart heavy but his mind clear. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of agency, a realization that he didn't have to accept this version of his life. As he climbed the stairs, he knew the hardest part was yet to come. But for now, he allowed himself a small measure of peace, knowing he had finally taken the first step toward reclaiming his dignity and his future. The morning after the confrontation, the house was eerily quiet. Michael had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. When he finally came downstairs, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. "We need to decide what we're doing," she said without looking up. Her tone was calm, almost businesslike, as though she were discussing the weather. Michael pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "I've already decided," he said firmly. "I can't stay in a marriage built on lies. If you want to make this right, you need to be honest. Not just with me, but with yourself." Emily sighed, setting her mug down. "I don't know if I can do that, Michael. I've been unhappy for a long time. And I didn't know how to tell you." "Unhappy," Michael repeated, the word cutting deeper than he expected. "Then why didn't you say something? Why didn't you give me a chance to fix it?" "I didn't think you could," Emily admitted. "You've always been so content. I didn't want to burden you with my doubts." Michael shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "So, instead, you decided to betray me? To lie and cheat and pretend everything was fine? Do you have any idea how much that hurts?" Emily didn't respond. Instead, she stared at the table, her silence speaking volumes. That day, they agreed to a trial separation. Emily would stay in the house while Michael moved into a small apartment across town. The decision was practical. There was no point in making things messier than they already were, but it still felt like a defeat. Packing his belongings was one of the hardest things Michael had ever done. Every item he placed in a box carried memories of a life he had tried so hard to build. Framed photos from vacations, gifts Emily had given him, little notes she used to leave on the fridge. By the time he finished, the boxes seemed heavier than they should have been, as though they carried not just possessions but the weight of his disappointment. As he loaded the last box into his Jeep, Emily stood on the porch, watching him. "Michael," she called out, her voice soft. He turned to face her, the distance between them feeling both literal and emotional. "For what it's worth," she said, "I am sorry." Michael studied her, searching for sincerity in her eyes. He found it there, but it was too little, too late. "I hope you figure out what you really want, Emily," he said finally. "But I can't keep sacrificing myself to make you happy." With that, he got in the Jeep and drove away, leaving behind the house that had once felt like home. The first few weeks in the apartment were a blur of loneliness and self-reflection. Michael threw himself into his work and his hobbies, trying to fill the void left by Emily's absence. He reached out to friends he had drifted away from, reconnecting with people who reminded him of the person he used to be before his marriage consumed his identity. One evening, Catherine stopped by with a casserole, her presence a welcome distraction. "I wanted to check on you," she said, setting the dish on the counter. Michael smiled weakly. "I'm managing. Barely." They sat and talked for hours, Catherine's quiet wisdom a balm for his wounded spirit. She didn't offer empty platitudes or try to sugarcoat the situation. Instead, she listened, letting Michael vent his frustrations and fears. "You deserve someone who sees your worth, Michael," Catherine said softly. "Don't forget that." Her words stayed with him long after she left. For the first time in weeks, Michael allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, there was life after Emily. The days turned into weeks, and while Michael's apartment still felt unfamiliar, he began to find comfort in the small routines he was creating. The solitude gave him space to think, not about Emily, but about himself, his future, and what he truly wanted from life. Emily, meanwhile, made little effort to reach out. Occasionally, she'd send a brief text, always logistical, a question about the bills, a reminder about the insurance. The distance between them, both physical and emotional, grew wider with each passing day. One Saturday afternoon, Michael returned to the house to pick up the last of his belongings. Emily greeted him at the door, her expression guarded. "Your things are in the guest room," she said. Michael nodded and walked past her. The house felt different, emptier. The vibrant life they'd once shared had been replaced by a sterile quiet, as though the walls themselves were mourning what had been lost. As he packed the last box, Emily appeared in the doorway. "Do you have a minute?" Michael hesitated but set the box down. "What is it?" She stepped into the room, her arms crossed protectively over her chest. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said. About honesty." Michael leaned against the dresser, waiting for her to continue. "I don't know if I ever really understood what I wanted," she admitted. "I thought I wanted control, independence, excitement. But I think I was just afraid. Afraid of being vulnerable, of losing myself." Her words were a far cry from the defiant Emily he'd confronted weeks ago. For a moment, Michael felt a flicker of the connection they once had. "I appreciate you saying that," he said. "But I can't keep doing this, Emily. I've spent so much time trying to be what you needed, and in the process, I lost sight of myself. I can't go back to that." Emily nodded, her eyes glistening. "I know. And I don't expect you to. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." The sincerity in her voice struck Michael deeply, but it wasn't enough to change his mind. "I hope you figure things out," he said gently. "I really do. But I think it's time for both of us to move on." The divorce was finalized quietly a few months later. Emily kept the house, while Michael moved into a larger apartment closer to his work. The process was surprisingly amicable, a stark contrast to the turmoil of their marriage's final days. As time passed, Michael began to heal. He reconnected with old friends, took up new hobbies, and even started dating again. It was a slow process, but with each step, he felt a little more like himself. One evening, as he walked through the park near his apartment, he spotted Catherine sitting on a bench, a book in her hands. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "Michael," she said warmly. "What a surprise." They talked for hours, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Catherine's kindness and honesty were a refreshing change, and for the first time in a long time, Michael felt a spark of hope for the future. Looking back, Michael realized that his marriage to Emily had taught him more than he ever expected. It had shown him the importance of self-worth, of setting boundaries, and of never settling for less than he deserved. As he moved forward, he carried those lessons with him, determined to build a life filled with honesty, respect, and love, both for himself and, someday, for someone new.